Chapter 9, Killing Mr. Griffin, page 102. We've got to go get Mark. The single sentence screamed again and again through his brain. We've got to go get Mark. Mark will know what to do. I got him back down the path, dragging Susan behind him, stumbling, falling once, getting up again. Susan's wrist still tightly encircled by his hand. It got him into the car, the key into the ignition, the engine into life. It took them back along the dirt road without running off the side into the underbrush, onto the highway without swerving and running headlong into an oncoming car. We've got to go get Mark. Mark will know what to do, he said it aloud, emphasizing each word. To do? How can anybody do anything? Susan said. You can't make a dead person come alive. She wasn't crying. Susan, whose tears had fallen continuously since the middle of the afternoon, was no longer weeping. David glanced sideways at her there on the seat beside him, dry-eyed and expressionless, her lips pressed tightly together except when they parted to let out the thin, flat voice come through. There's nothing Mark can do, Susan said. We're murderers. We didn't kill him. We hardly touched him. I swear it, Sue. Nobody roughed up the guy. He was fine when we left him. You know what he said to us? Mark told him, beg us, Mr. G. Plead with us. And he said, I most certainly will not. Does that sound like a guy who's been banged around? People don't just die for no reason. This guy did. I swear it. Honestly, we didn't hurt him. The worst we did was tie the rope around him. That could never kill anybody. David bore down on the accelerator. We've got to get to Mark. He'll know how to handle things, who to call, what to do. What the hell do you do when somebody's dead like that for no reason way out in the mountains? Who goes and gets them? An ambulance couldn't ever make it up that road. We can go to my house and get my dad, Susan said. He'll help us. Mark first. We can't do anything until we tell Mark. My God, Sue, why did we have to be the ones to find him? If you hadn't insisted we go up there, it would have been Mark and Jeff. They'd have taken care of things. It was crazy for us to have ever gone up there without telling them or anything. They pulled into the Del Norte parking lot. It was seething with activity. Voices shouted, headlights blinked on in all directions. Car horns blasted as automobiles tried to inch their way into the creeping lines of traffic. The game must just be over, Susan said. You'll never find him in this. Sure I will. We're in luck. There are parking spaces. There was one right ahead of him, and David pulled into it, braking and shifting suddenly so as to pass the fender of the car next to him. Come on, let's get in there. I'm not going. What do you mean you're not going? I just can't face it. All those people yelling and screaming because we won or lost a basketball game. David, what's wrong with you? We don't belong here. We ought to be okay. He didn't want to listen to her any longer. I'm going to find Mark. This is your last chance to come with me. Are you coming? I want my father. We'll talk about that later. We'll tell Mark first. Are you coming? No. Then sit here and wait. I'll be back in a minute. We'll be back in a minute. He left the car and half walked, half ran across the parking lot. People were pouring out of the doorways to the gym. He had to stand on the edge of the flood, working his way in between two outward rushing people, then between another pair. Somebody shouted, "Hey, Dave, where you going?" Somebody else gave him a hard shove in the ribs with an elbow, muttering, "The tide goes in the other direction, good buddy." Mark. Where was Mark? David worked his way down an aisle. The crowd was thinning now, and there was nobody left on the gym floor. The score was still posted on the board. Home team 61, visitors 57. Del Norte had won. Then, as usual, There was no way anybody defeated Jeff when he charged down the court, a head taller than anyone else. That ball under absolute control. Why couldn't the rest of life be controlled so easily? How could things get out of hand so quickly? Mark, where are you? Then he saw him at last, down at the end of the court in front of the door to the locker room, standing with Betsy. Dave broke into a run, his eyes trained on them, unable to see anything except the two figures. Mark! He opened his mouth to shout the name, but no sound came out. Mark! 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 His lips kept moving, but nothing came from between them. They saw him now. Both of them had turned toward him. Betsy with her lips parted, her eyes wide and astonished. Why, it's David. Mark's face was inscrutable. Yeah, it's David. Well, boy, how goes it? Something the matter? He's dead, David said. He had not meant to state it so abruptly. The words flew out of him, escaping from his throat and over the top of his tongue before he could stop them, before he could weigh what he was saying. He's dead. There was a moment of silence. Then Mark said, Griffin? Yes. How do you know? Sue and I went up there. We looked at him. There's no guessing about it, Mark. He's gone. He's gone. How could one describe those eyes staring upward into the far-reaching, incredible space of the night sky? He's dead, Mark. I believe you. Betsy was staring at both of them, speechless. Where's Sue? Mark asked. Why isn't she with you? She's out in the car. In the lot? Here? Yes. Then get out there, boy. She might take off across the place and yell to a pig. She's all spaced out, that chick. Run, now. I mean it. Aren't you coming? Sure, I'm coming. I've got to wait for Jeff. Betsy, you go with Dave. Do something about Sue. You know how she'll go, a total basket case. He reached out suddenly and touched Betsy's cheek. His hand light, almost, but not quite a caress. Hey, girl, I'm counting on you. Yes, okay. Betsy's eyes were huge in her round face. David said, it's not true, is it? It can't be, can it? Mark, he's not really, get going, will you? Nobody needs to see us standing together like this. Jeff will be out in a minute, and we'll come join you. They went. They crossed the corner of the gym floor together, David's hand placed protectively beneath Betsy's elbow. A few people turned back, smiled at each other. Guess what? A new romance. The senior class president and the head cheerleader. What a perfect combination. Why hadn't it happened sooner? You didn't mean it, did you, David? It's all a joke, isn't it? A real funny one, David said numbly. He tightened his grip on her elbow until his nails bit into her flesh and she jerked away from him. Where am I? He asked himself in bewilderment. What am I doing here? Where has the night gone? It's a dream. That's all. One of those crazy dreams that seems so real, and yet you know all the time, down underneath, that in a minute you'll wake up. A moment ago, it was 6 o'clock. We were eating dinner. Mother and Graham and I, and then I went out. And I stopped at Susan's, and then, they reached the door to the outside. Now they were through it, walking together across the parking lot. Where was the car? Over there, David said. That's it, over there. It was the only car parked alone and unmoving amid the turmoil of flaring lights and sounding horns. Sue was still in it. He could see her profile outlined against the lights of the cars beyond. Her head was turned at a right angle with her eyes focused on the gym doors. Her chin was high. She was still not crying. Even before entering the car, he could tell that by the lift of her chin. They reached the car and opened the door and climbed in. Susan turned, his glance going past Betsy, past David. Where's Mark? Coming. He had to wait for Jeff. You said you'd get him. Did you tell him? Yes. He'll be along in a minute. Are you okay, Sue? Betsy asked. You're not going to go to pieces or anything, are you? You look like you're okay. Here they come, David said with relief. That's Jeff. See, over there against the lights. Mark must have dragged him out before he hit the showers. Did you tell him? Susan asked again. I said I did, didn't I? Her calm was frightening to him because it was so unnatural. He reached out for her and could not find her hand. He wished suddenly that he could throw himself across the seat that lay between them and put his arms around her and hold her and tell her to go ahead and cry and cry. Cry for herself and for him too, for Mr. Griffin alone on the bank of the mountain stream, for all of them. Jeff and Mark were closer now, a tall figure and a shorter one, working their way across the lot. Eventually, they reached the car. And Mark opened the front door on the far side. Shove over, he said. Move over, Sue. I'm getting in beside you. Dave, you get this thing going. Jeff, getting back with Betsy. Where do you want to go? David asked. Anywhere, Mark said. Give me a minute and I'll think of a place. Meanwhile, just drive. Get us out of here. Dave started the engine and drove out of the lot and turned east on Montgomery. After they had gone a few miles, Mark said, pull in here. It was a lot behind a row of apartment buildings, and David steered the car carefully into it and drew to a stop behind a garbage bin. He turned off the key, and there was silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Mark drew a long breath. Well, he said, it looks like your dream came true, Jeff, old boy. We killed Mr. Griffin for real. We didn't, Jeff said. We didn't do anything to him. Nobody's going to stick this on me. I hardly touched him. Nobody can stick it on any of us, Mark said. We've got our alibis. Dave was with his grandmother all afternoon watching television. You and I were at Betsy's. We've got that solid, Betsy said. The woman next door phoned Mom tonight while we were eating dinner and complained about how we played records so loud we woke her kid up from his nap. And tonight, most of us were at the game. People saw us there. The best thing now is to show up at the snack and soda as usual and then hit it for home. You mean not tell anybody? Susan said in amazement. Why should we do that? Why? Because there's a man dead? Would he be any less dead if we told people? No, of course not, but you can't just have somebody die and not report it. If we reported it, we'd have to tell about the kidnapping, Jeff said. Who'd believe us when we explained how we were just having a little fun? They'd check over his body and there'd be bruises on him where he fell down, and maybe the ropes have made cuts on his arms and legs. Whatever happened to make him die, that would be blamed on us too, even though we didn't have a darn thing to do with it. We could end up in jail. We're minors, Betsy reminded him. Minors can't be jailed, can they? Besides, my dad's on the county commission. Hold it, Bets, Mark said. We wouldn't be considered minors now. What do you mean? Betsy asked in bewilderment. We're all of us underage. If somebody's killed during the commission of a felony, it's first-degree murder, Mark said. Kidnapping's a felony, no matter what our ages. We'd be tried as adults. But that's not fair, exclaimed Betsy. Besides, it wasn't a real kidnapping. It was a joke. Who's going to believe that? Jeff asked. We could spend the rest of our lives in jail. And talking about your dad, think what this would do to him. It would be all over the papers. County commissioner's daughter indicted for murder. Christ. And my mother. David felt a wave of nausea hit his stomach. There's no way I could tell my mother. We have to tell, Susan insisted. We don't have a choice. People will be looking for him. Mrs. Griffin will call the police, and Mr. Griffin won't show up to teach tomorrow, and everybody will know he's missing. Lots of people turn up missing, Mark said. It happens every day. Right, Dave? Dave nodded. They do. Men leave home. They go. Just light out and go, and years go by, and nobody ever finds out where they went. Their wives go on all night. Oh, their wives go on all right. It's tough maybe, but they make out. His own mother's face rose up before him. The lines etched deep around the corners of the eyes and mouth. Saint, the Reverend Chandler had called her. She had liked that. Not every woman had the chance to become a saint. It was rough, of course, but was it really any worse than being a widow? We're clean as soon as we get rid of two things, Mark said. the body, and the car. Once those are gone, there's nothing left to worry about. We can't do anything tonight. It's too dark and too late. And we can't cut school tomorrow. It'll have to be tomorrow afternoon. We can get a hold of a shovel. Or who can get a hold of a shovel? I can, Jeff said. We got one in the garage. What about an extra license plate? Silence followed the question. Then Jeff said, maybe Tony? No way, Mark said firmly. We're not letting anybody else in on this. There are too many of us involved already. If we take the North Road down from the mountains, we can come into a town via Coors Road. That should be pretty safe if we time it to hit the evening traffic. All those people who work in the Levi and Singer factories come home that way. We'll be part of the swarm. And then what? Betsy asked. Once we get the car back to town, what do we do with it? We can park it at the airport. That lot's always full and cars get left there for months at a time. When they do find it, if they do, it will look like Griffin took a plane someplace. And the body? David forced out the question. You're planning for us to bury it? That's simple enough. Right where it is now is a perfect place. Nobody ever goes there, and the dirt will be soft because of the stream. No! The word burst from Susan's lips like a cry of pain. We can't do that. Just take Mr. Griffin and stick him in the ground? We can't pretend it never happened, that we're not responsible. We killed him, all 5 of us. Somehow, we killed him. I don't know how, but if we hadn't done what we did, he would still be alive this minute. You can't know that, Mark said reasonably. I do know it. People don't just fall down dead for no reason. And they don't just fall down dead from being tied up for a few hours. I don't care what you say. We've got to tell somebody. My father, Sue, simmer down, baby. Mark's voice was suddenly gentle. I know how you feel. You and Dave were the ones who found him. That was rough, but that's over now. You don't have to go up there again. The rest of us will take care of everything. It's going to be all right, baby, I promise. It can't be all right, Susan cried miserably. Mr. Griffin is dead. Did you stop to think he might be dead regardless? Mark placed his hand under her chin, turning her face to his. Look, sweetie, we didn't do this guy in. You know it. Dolly Luna got kidnapped by her students last semester, right? She didn't fall dead on them. It's a sick person who dies like that, without a reason. It could have happened anywhere, in his home, behind his desk at school, walking down the street. When your body quits on you, that's it. Wouldn't it have been worse if he had been behind the wheel of his car and plowed straight into a bunch of kids waiting for the school bus? If he had been at home, his wife could have called a doctor, Susan said. My own dad was at home when he died, Mark said softly. It would have been better if he hadn't have been. He was in his bed, asleep, and the house burned down. Oh, Mark, she regarded him with horror. How awful. Darn right it was awful. The point is, when it's your time to go, you go. You can't keep saying, if this and if that. It doesn't change anything. You can't go back and change anything. You've just got to keep on living. Wrecking our own lives wouldn't bring Mr. G back. Now would it? It wouldn't help at all. It would just destroy us and people who love us. My parents couldn't bear it, Susan said. Nothing like this ever happens to people like my parents. They're so nice and normal. They just think about things like cooking and property taxes. They don't have to know. Nobody does. It's all right, Sue. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her over against him. It's all right, Sue. Susie, it's all right, baby. Just trust old Mark, okay? It's all going to be all right. The tears came at last with the suddenness of a dam bursting. One gigantic sob that seemed to shake the car, and then the wild, heavy weeping. Mark's other arm came around her, and he held her through the storm, his face still and impassive. The heavy-lidded eyes, half closed, staring out through the front car window into the darkness beyond. He held her that way for a long time. When the weeping slowed, he turned to David. "Do you have a handkerchief?" David did, in his back pants pocket. He dug it out and handed it to Susan, who took off her glasses and wiped her eyes and blew her nose. "Let's head for the snack and soda," Mark said to David. "We'll hang around there just long enough to have a Coke so people will see us. Then we'll go home."